Welcome to the Shortlist announcement of the 2020 Cundill History Prize. My name's Peter Frankopan, Professor of Global History at Oxford University, and I'm delighted to be the chair of the jury of the 2020 Cundill History Prize. Before I announce the shortlist, I thought it would be a good idea to take a critical look at this very strange last few months and times that we're living through. So to do this, I've caught up with three of the recent winners of the Cundill Prize, world-famous historians, each of them, to ask a few questions about how they contextualise and understand what we're living through their own knowledge of history. So first is Julia Lovell, Professor of Modern China at Birkbeck College, University of London, who won the prize in 2019 for Maoism, her brilliant re-evaluation of Maoism as a force that played out around the world. Then the Harvard Professor of History, Jasanoff, who won in 2018 with the Dawn Watch, a genre-bending account of the life and the world of Joseph Conrad. And then Daniel Beer, Reader in Modern History at Royal Holloway, University of London, who took the prize in 2017 for The House of the Dead, a groundbreaking study of Siberian penal colonies. As a leading expert on China, Julia, you must have been aware of the COVID outbreak in Wuhan early on and its significance long before others were. Take us so briefly from then until the present day. What have we seen? What's happened? And how's China handled the situation, both globally, but also, perhaps more interestingly, domestically?
There are two major phases to China's response to COVID, and both phases show respectively the weakness and then the strength of its authoritarian political system. For weeks through December and early January, local party officials in Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus in central China, suppressed news about this terrifying new disease. And this impulse reflected pressure coming from China's authoritarian centre to have only good news coming out of the localities. So it showcased the dangers of lacking a free press, sort of lacking free discussion in the country. But when the outbreak became too difficult, too big to ignore, the central authorities took radical action. So they locked down Wuhan, a city of 11 million. And this lockdown remained in place until the middle of April. And the method was brutal but effective in suppressing the spread of the virus into other parts of China. And the absoluteness of this method is something that can only be achieved by the kind of authoritarian, centralized state that you see in China.
Epidemics and plagues and disease, Daniel, we've seen all of this before. Can you give us a bit of perspective from where you stand on what you think we're currently living through?
Well, I think if we look at sort of major epidemics in the kind of modern period, whether that's outbreaks of cholera in Europe in the 19th century or, of course, the Spanish influenza at the end of the First World War, I think that what they show is that they do, I think, two sort of very important things. They hugely stretch the administrative resources of states. So they kind of force states to become much more interventionist than they would otherwise be. And of course, certain states have ideologies that kind of lend themselves to that kind of administrative overreach. For other states, it's a much more uncomfortable sort of set of policies to wear. But we see epidemics accelerating the expansion and the penetration of state power into societies. And I think the other thing that it shows is that these epidemics are a very radical kind of stress test on social cohesion. So they challenge our ideas of solidarity and collective sacrifice.
And Maya, as a historian whose work has always had a global perspective, what's your take? Are we living through a moment of real reordering right now of continents, of cultures, and of countries? Or are we just living through a blip that will reset and go back to where we were and we'll think about other things in the future? Will 2020 and COVID really be something that shapes the world of the future?
There's a little bit of a boy who cried wolf quality about the way that people talk about current affairs, you know, that this is the biggest thing, that's the biggest thing, oh no, cataclysm, etc. But you know what? Sometimes things really are big. This is the biggest global pandemic in a century. It has triggered massive global economic turmoil, and I think that this is definitely one for the history books. More specifically, I think that what it's going to do is stand out in retrospect as a moment that crystallizes certain trends that have been going on for a long time. So in terms of a global reordering, there has for some time now been a shift in the centers of economic power away from Western Europe and the United States in particular and toward China. And I believe that in retrospect, when people go back to write the history books for the 21st century, 2020 is going to stand out as the year when American hegemony, claims to economic greatness and moral and principled leadership will be seen to have come to an end.
China's relations with the United States and with other countries, Julia, are at a real low right now. We see all sorts of different noises coming out of Washington, Beijing, and elsewhere thinking about that relationship. What does COVID mean for China's place in the world right now? And does that have a big significance for Europe, for African countries, for other places in Asia?
We're at a very dangerous moment right now in terms of China's tense relations with Western countries, especially the US, Australia, and also the UK. The relationship with China is all set to be a touch paper issue in the upcoming US election later this year. More broadly, I see COVID-19 as a turning point for China's place and self-projection in the world, especially given the catastrophic response of the US government under Trump to handling its own epidemic within the United States. China has really quite effectively been able to portray itself as a paragon, a kind of model of pandemic management. It's also portrayed itself as an international benefactor, distributing much needed PPE all across the world. And I see a new sense of self-confidence, even aggression coming out of China's government about its superpower status. China has a long-term, extremely successful strategy of being a world leader in high tech. And this ability, this capability is something on which both the West and the developing world is increasingly coming to depend. So historians, I believe, will see 2020 and COVID-19 as the moments at which China's place in the world transformed.
Maya, the pandemic has had a big impact on how we think about and research and teach history at university. What's your experience been these last few months? Has it changed the way in which you work, you think, and life for your students? Has that changed in a very dramatic way?
I teach at a residential college, so normally we are all gathering here together, thousands of us in the same space, and in fact it creates a kind of equal playing field of sorts for people who come from an incredibly diverse array of backgrounds and places. And now, everybody is dispersed, so instead we're gathering in the virtual space of the kind of mosaic tiles of a Zoom classroom. And things are lost as a result of that. There isn't space for the kind of casual conversation that you might have when you run into somebody in the hall or you sit next to them in a lecture room. What I miss as an instructor is laughter. When I make a joke, to a lecture hall, I can get the laughter. When I make a joke to Zoom, it just dies. On the other hand, I think that the Zoom classroom can also do things for us. It creates a kind of intimacy, and I think it has encouraged students sometimes to bring things to the conversation that they might not otherwise if we were in the other kind of space. And the second thing I would just underline is that I think there's a shared consciousness that we're living through a historic moment, because we are. And as a result, I think it's making people turn to history. perhaps in a way they hadn't before, and to think more specifically about the connections between history and the present, and I think too between the present, this historic present, and the future to come.
And we need good, well-written history more than ever, Daniel. Have you got any advice for aspiring young or old historians about how to write in a way that breaks boundaries, but also does that in a way that's accessible?
Well, I hesitate to dole out advice, but I can sort of say what I have done and what I continue to do in my own writing, which is, in a sense, not to worry too much about genres. So I think that ranging across bits of social history, economic history, biography, sort of literary history, and so on, I find that's a kind of a productive sort of mashup of different approaches. And I think when we're talking about how to make history accessible, I think we as readers of history, people are drawn to stories. And I think that if you're able to kind of take a set of individual stories and sort of knit them together into a much broader sort of canvas of experiences, that's a way of kind of communicating with a broader audience. It sort of draws them into what might be can be otherwise quite a sort of complex, impersonal set of historical forces, but it's a way of kind of giving them a human face.
Great. Well, thank you, Julia, Daniel and Maya, for joining us today and for those fantastic insights. So as a jury, we've spent a lot of these strange times reading through lots of books. We've all had a bit more time on our hands, perhaps, than normal. And it's been a pleasure to read such an outstanding set of books pulled together for the prize entry this year. And 2020 has been a year of really profound change for many different kinds of ways and different reasons, not just about pandemic. And studying and reading history helps us, I think, remember the people, the places, the times and the periods, for good and for bad, when history has changed in individual countries, in regions, in continents, and globally. So for sure, there's been a resonance in the books that we've chosen that speak to us, I think, about the present day as well. It's been a huge pleasure working with such a distinguished and brilliant jury. I'm very grateful to them individually and collectively for the insights and experience they have, all of them incredibly experienced communicators, writers and thinkers, and also, of course, to the team behind the Cundill Prize for getting this all up and running. And the shortlist we've chosen is richly varied. It's exciting. These books are illuminating. And one of the things that makes the Cundill Prize so important for historians is the encouragement that it gives to really good history writing and to really good writing. One of the most important parts of the Cundill Prize is to connect readers across not just academic disciplines, but into the more general readership too. So we've had lots of discussions about what kinds of books are going to make an impact on readers and what kind of books are going to make an impact on the study and the field of history. So I'm delighted now to announce the 10 books that we've chosen to be on our shortlist for 2020. First, Greece, The Biography of a Modern Nation by Roderick Beaton.
Roderick Beaton's book, Greece, A Biography of a Modern Nation, is a fascinating history, not just of modern Greece or the modern Greek state, but of the idea of Greece. He begins in the 18th century when there were Greeks scattered around the Balkans and around the Black Sea, but they didn't have the idea of themselves as a single country or nation. And he explains how Greeks began looking back to ancient Greece. They sought to revive the memory of ancient Greece, and using that idea, built modern Greece. And what's fascinating is he then traces the history of this idea. What did Greek mean? What was Greekness? All through civil wars, political conflicts, World War II, right up to the present and the moment of financial crisis. And even if you're somebody who doesn't know much about Greece, or hasn't read much about it, you'll find the book fascinating because this question of who are we as a nation? Who are we English? Who are we British? Who are we Canadians? Who are we Americans? Is one that we deal with all the time, and it's become much more pertinent now. And I think that reading the book will help you reflect on the history of your own country. You know, what's the idea behind your country? How did it come to be? And why is it the way it is now? It's a book based on really a wide use of archives and a lifetime study of both modern and ancient Greece. And, you know, I recommend it highly.
Tacky's Revolt, The Story of an Atlantic Slave War by Vincent Brown.
Brown's book is important because he tells us things we don't know about Tacky's Revolt. Most accounts have relied on what the British and the island's white authorities were able to extract from the participants in Tacky's Revolt. They tortured a lot of the captives. We know that testimony from torture oftentimes isn't accessible. Tacky's Revolt, in some ways, is as much a work of African history as it is American and West Indian history. Very important in that regard. And he also shows this is the largest enslaved insurrection in the British Empire during the 18th century. It made a huge impression upon white Jamaicans. They cracked down on the island's enslaved inhabitants afterwards. And it also plays a big role in explaining why Jamaica had so little sympathy for the American Revolution when it erupted 15 years later. Vincent Brown tells the story beautifully. It's a real page-turner. Although it's very analytical history, it's also a wonderful narrative history.
The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company by William Dalrymple.
William Dalrymple is well known for his powerful and beautiful storytelling, and his new book lives up to expectations on this front. It's a story that deserves to be told and told again, because arguably it's an important story in the history of modern colonization, how a vast landmass populated by so many different kinds of people and intellectual traditions was taken into a stranglehold by a company that mutated into a state. This company, the East India Company, is the subject of the book. And it also then, secondly, speaks to this broader kind of argument, which is about the nature of corporations and the power that they wield yet in our world. This is a work of art, in many senses, Dalrymple's book, with beautiful illustrations and with the font even chosen with history in mind.
India in the Persian Age, 1000 to 1765 by Richard Eaton.
Richard Eaton's book is an ambitious work that ranges over a huge span of India's complicated history. Its main argument is about the merging of two different worlds, a Persian world and a Sanskrit world, which gives rise to new forms of rule, new cultural practices, new social practices, science, art, literature, food, and so on. He defines the medieval in South Asia as this diffusion of Persian texts from west to east. And as he defines it like this, he distances himself from a view of the Persianate world conquering India. It's a book that will certainly create disquiet for those who seek to purify or isolate India's history by way of religion, culture, ethnicity, or politics. It will be easily added to introductory courses in South Asian and world history.
Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Rivalry That Unraveled the Middle East by Kim Gattas.
Black Wave by Kim Gattas asks a deceptively simple question. What happened to us? It's a fundamental question. And it's being asked by so many at what is a moment of massive disruption and discontent across the Middle East and far beyond. And she answers it by looking at an old history in a new way. She decides to take us back to a pivotal year, 1979, and a crucial fault line, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which resonates far beyond their borders. The jury felt this was history which makes headlines today, and Black Wave brings it to life through solid research and vivid storytelling. It's the kind of history book which will reach many readers. It informs and entertains, and so it meets all of our criteria: clarity, quality, and consequential.
Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter by Kerry Greenridge.
Trotter, as the title suggests, was a radical African-American politician and property developer from Boston. As Greenidge notes, Trotter is not exactly a household name. As Greenidge reminds us, though, he embraced a radical vision of black politics. He advocated for many of the things that we hear black politicians and advocates advocating for now. Their important resonances here, as Greenidge notes in her book, with the current Black Lives Matter movement. So Trotter's a very important figure, and Greenidge brings him to life in this wonderful book. I have to confess, the hardest thing for me about this book was that I couldn't skip anything. I had to read every page. I kept wanting to know what was going to happen next.
The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, by Rashid Khalidi.
Scholarly research, a new conceptual framework, and a fascinating family history. These are just three of the qualities which made Rashid Khalidi's book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, stand out for our jury. It's history and autobiography. It's political as well as personal. This is an impassioned narrative from a Palestinian perspective, but it's firmly rooted in analytical rigor and a clear-eyed examination of two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, and two major powers, Britain and the United States, which have forged the history of a conflict which unfolds to this day. Khalidi's new interpretation of an old conflict through the lens of settler colonialism is brought to life by his compelling narrative, which draws from his own family history and role over many decades, including Khalidi's own engagement at the front lines of recent international diplomacy.
Providence Lost, The Rise and Fall of Cromwell's Protectorate by Paul Lay.
Paul Lay's Providence Lost describes a piece of history that you might think you know about, but probably you don't, or you haven't thought about it this way in a long time. It describes that moment in the English Civil War between the time of the execution of one king and the crowning of a new king, when England was governed by what's often remembered or is described as parliamentary democracy. In fact, as Lay explains and illustrates, this was really a moment when England experienced it's a kind of authoritarian or totalitarian dictatorship, or rather an attempt to create one, to the extent that that was possible in the 17th century. The book contains one pen portrait after another of extraordinary people in unusual circumstances, up to and including Cromwellian's one attempt to create a colony in the New World that was meant to be an ideal new society in the Caribbean. If you think you know the history of the Civil War and you think you studied it all in the past, I think this book will surprise you. There'll be new details, and it'll give you some new ways of thinking about England and Englishness.
Unworthy Republic, The Dispossession of Native Americans and the Road to Indian Territory by Claudio Sant.
Jackson's India removal is easily one of the most notorious moments in the United States' long history of dispossession of North America's indigenous inhabitants, First Peoples, the Native Americans. So this is a familiar story, but Sant takes a new and breathtakingly original approach to this sad story. Part of the strengths of Sant's book is the compelling narrative that he tells. This is an extremely well-written, gripping story. He takes the readers through the story blow by blow, following the stories of some of the key actors in that. In some ways, though, the most fascinating part about Sant's story is the interpretive spin that he puts on it.
And Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs by Camilla Townsend.
Camilla Townsend's The Fifth Son is a feat of high order, intellectually and imaginatively. It's a moving and immersive account of the Mexica people in what is today's Mexico. It links pre-conquest with the conquest period, the violent conquest period by the Spanish, and the post-conquest period as well. The book relies on nahuatl sources, which Townsend uses with great skill. She presents these peoples as complex in their intentionality. They endure and keep enduring through this dramatic period of change over such a long period. As she presents her story, she dismisses some very, very long-standing tropes about these people. For instance, the extent of human sacrifice, or the fact that they were fatally impacted by colonization. So in this sense, it's a gripping read, but also a book of scholarly value.
This is a wonderful list of books. Individually, they're outstanding, and as a group, they make for a wonderful collection. There are some classics in there, there's no doubt about that.
2020's Cundill Prize highlights some of the themes that are going on in historical thought right now. There are stories of imperial and colonial history, but told from the perspective of those subject to it. This makes for challenging and confrontational reading, difficult at times, but all the more powerful because of it. Camilla Townsend's Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, uses Nahuatl language texts to give an Aztec view on the actions of the conquistadors, and crucially places this in the longer context of the Aztec world, spiking any sense that this only becomes an interesting story when Europeans are involved. Claudio Sounds' Unworthy Republic talks about the Indian Removal Act and the expulsion of indigenous peoples from their lands in America in the 1830s. It speaks of corporate action and government involvement here. And on that theme, William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, the relentless rise of the East India Company, is again a story of the welding of corporate and imperial ambitions. As ever with the Cundill, it's the geographical spread that makes the list a delight. From Greece to Palestine and the Middle East, India, and to Britain, with Paul Lay's book on the Cromwellian Protectorate. 2020 is of course the year of BLM, with big questions being asked about the bedrock of Western culture and wealth, particularly in terms of slaveholding. Vincent Brown's Tacky's Revolt tells of the violent uprising of enslaved West Africans in Jamaica in 1760, using methods that would be familiar today. And finally, Kerry Greenidge's Black Radical is the life and times of William Monroe Trotter. Trotter edited the black weekly newspaper The Guardian in the early 20th century, and his radicalism and activism against racial injustice is a topic which again seems resonant in 2020.
Really good history helps take the reader along a journey, and it's important that good, new, groundbreaking history explains to the reader what's new, what's important, and why it matters. And each of these books does that in very different ways. Some focus on individuals and on their lives, some on a series of moments or incidents that have had a profound impact on a region or on the world, and some look at multiple centuries spanning, in some cases, 500, 600 or 700 years worth of history. But each of those shows just how vibrant and how alive and flourishing non-fiction writing is in the world today. For all the disappointments and the frustrations we have in the world, history is alive and well. So I'd be delighted for anyone watching or listening to this to pick up as many of these books as they can. They're absolutely brilliant. It's going to be difficult to decide which will be the top 3 books and which will be the winner. But I really hope that you'll be able to join us again in a few weeks' time when we make that announcement. But for now, I leave you with the 10 books that are the shortlist for the 2020 Cundill History Prize, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual shortlist announcement, the first of many events to come in our 2020 season calendar. Bringing the Cundill History Prize to you in this extraordinary year is not without its challenges, but we feel so strongly that perhaps now more than ever, our prize needs to perform its vital function of championing the best history writing out there. The 10 books that the jurors have presented to you today are outstanding examples of what the History Prize celebrates. Works of real relevance and consequence that are so finely crafted, they are also fantastic reads. And I hope that many of you will seek out and discover these exceptional books. However, this is only the beginning. On October 20th, we will come together again, wherever we are in the world, and that is when the jury will announce the 3 2020 finalists. In November, when the prize usually returns from its roadshow to Montreal, its home, for a celebratory gala, we are instead putting together a whole festival of events to celebrate the prize. The highlights include a very special evening with our 3 finalists, the Cundill History Prize lecture delivered by last year's winner, Professor Julia Lovell, and of course, the 2020 winner announcement. I really hope you will be with us. For all of it, do sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media for all the latest news. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you soon.